You're watching Going Underground. I'm Afshin Rattansi. Coming up in the show, Cabinet Minister Ian Duncan Smith may have maxed out his credit cards, but has he maxed out on child poverty? And as Americans around the world celebrate Independence Day, NSA whistleblower Thomas Drake tells us Obama's Freedom Act has given the people of the United States anything but their freedom. Also, worried about Facebook spying on you? Maybe you should sign up to Minds.com. Plus,
no wonder they call him Doggy Day!
Classic Labour shouts at David Cameron at this week's PMQs. All this and more on today's Going Underground. As Americans celebrate Independence Day, what has the role of Washington been in the Greece crisis leading up to tomorrow's referendum on austerity? Jack Lew, President Obama's Treasury Secretary, has left no one in any doubt about what Washington wants Syriza to do.
If the Greeks are prepared to take the kinds of tough steps that they need to take, they find a pathway to resolving this without there being an accident and an unnecessary crisis.
America and NATO are terrified that Greece may embrace the international community, let alone BRICS countries like Russia. It's exemplified by media in NATO countries like this from the UK state-mandated BBC.
If Mr. Tsipras is seen to be cozying up to President Putin, allowing him to play divide and rule, that will be regarded as deeply unhelpful at a time when no one can be quite sure where relations between the EU and Russia are heading.
Where are we heading, and what's deeply unhelpful, though? How about allegations being investigated by Greek anti-corruption magistrate Dimitris Foukas? He's found that former Greek Prime Minister Kostas Karamanlis and 100 others were being wiretapped by a US Secret Service agent. The revelations came from a mobile phone operator, Vodafone. But that's not all when it comes to Karamanlis, who is now a Greek member of parliament. The Greek magistrate has also been investigating attempts to assassinate the Conservative former Prime Minister over his attempts to pursue closer relations with Russia. The magistrate referred to diplomatic cables published by WikiLeaks as underlining Washington's unhappiness with the Greek government's approach. Maybe tomorrow's referendum shouldn't be the only thing that Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras is bracing himself for. This week, infamous thrift expert and Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, Ian Duncan Smith, got his card blocked after spending too much. It was also a week when he announced that he wants to scrap Britain's child poverty target. So what is the government's attitude to inequality? David Cameron said proudly on Wednesday that inequality is declining in the UK. Someone who begs to differ is the Halford Mackinder Professor of Geography at the University of Oxford, Danny Dorling, author of Injustice: Why Social Inequality Still Persists. Welcome back, Danny, to Going Underground. So why is it a good time to re-release a book called Injustice and Why Social Inequality Still Persists when David Cameron only this week reiterated at the dispatch box that inequality has gone down compared to under the Labour government?
You need to produce a book or re-release a book called Injustice to help David Cameron understand why he's wrong. He clearly needs more education. It's been 5 years since we looked in detail at the extent of injustices, inequalities in health and wealth and so on. So I thought it was worth updating it, seeing what the coalition had done, seeing the gaps widening under the coalition, and seeing them...
So why does Cameron keep saying this again and again? Inequality is going down.
He's using surveys that don't include the top 1%. So the standard income surveys of Britain don't include the richest 1%, and for 99% of people there have been slight reductions in inequality. When the cuts come to the very bottom, that's going to get worse. But if you take out the best 1%, inequality has reduced. The problem is that the best 1% really do exist. They take about 15% of all our income. They're the most likely people to avoid taxation. And when you include the top 1%, you see that inequalities have actually risen under Cameron's stewardship of the economy. And when you look at wealth, they've risen even more.
So it's a statistical conjuring act.
It's a conjuring act.
It confuses the opposition.
It confuses the opposition so they don't pull it apart. But it is interesting because until 2010, within the 99%, inequalities were rising as well. It's only been since 2010 when inequalities have fallen for most people, except the very rich are getting richer, so that people don't feel better off. You don't say, this is great, we're coming together again, because you're getting collectively poorer, and one group of people, the group who own most things, the group who have most power, the group that Cameron and Nick Clegg and actually even Ed Miliband sat in by dint of their income and their partner's income, that group have done better and better and better.
So you isolate five faces of social inequality, elitism, exclusion, prejudice, greed, and despair. Take us through some of those.
Okay. It's the ways that being in a very unequal society changes your life. So if you look at elitism, we tend to produce a rationale that says it's okay to spend an enormous amount of money on a few children and spend much less, sometimes 6, 7, 8 times less money a year on the education of most children, because a few children must be really special. They must be really special because their parents must be really special. Otherwise, how could you justify the huge incomes of their parents? There must be something in their parents, and then their parents may pass that something in them on, and then you've got to spend a lot of money at selective schools, training them to be future leaders. Now, other countries in Europe just don't do this. They all have inequalities in education, but there's nowhere else in the rich world which spends so much on so few children as the UK. And the UK is the most economically unequal country in Europe. There's one place you can go in the world to find more inequality in educational spending, and that's Chile. But you really have to go to Chile to find a more unfair system of education than the one we have in the UK.
So that first one, elitism, really does begin right at the beginning. The state subsidised private schools like Eton. And,
well, they let them off taxation, but it's more the idea that you need to have private schools. Germany has hardly any private schools, and the private schools it does have are for the rather slow members of the upper classes. The brighter children of the upper classes don't go to private schools in Germany. France has very few.
But when you
Finland
talk about
has none.
exceptionalism, maybe there is a secret belief, maybe in the civil service, higher reaches of that. That's what makes Britain great, precisely because of this exceptionalism when it comes to education.
I mean, Britain was at the heart of eugenics a century or so ago, and Britain was very unequal then, and there was this belief that there was a race of the English, and amongst the English were the truly able English, and they would rule the planet in an empire. Now, that kind of belief became unpopular, particularly in the Second World War, in the 60s and 70s, as we became economically more equal. We went against the idea that there were some few special people. We created schools for everybody, comprehensive schools. We increased the amount of people who could go to university massively, and then our economic inequalities began to rise again at the end of the 70s, and in the 80s, and in the 90s, and the divisions in school spending rise again. It begins to matter which school in the town you go to. House prices go up in the expensive part of town with the supposed good school. Other schools are seen to fail.
That, when it comes to prejudice, it's precisely their free school academy program, private, quasi-private schools, for the whole population rather than just for the elite. They're going to solve exactly the issues you're talking about.
They're going to help solve them, yes. You just allow people to set up schools where they want. So we have £241 million of government money being spent on setting up free schools in areas where there are already enough school places, because they believe in this competition, because they believe you need some schools for the specially gifted children and others for the masses. You have to believe things like that if you're going to justify the level of economic inequalities we have. And that's why we have a free school programme and why it's producing so many schools in areas that already have enough schools.
But of course, parents watching this will say, but those schools are better. I want to send my child to them, and will vote for a government that supports them, maybe.
Some will, just like a large number of parents would always vote for grammar schools. Partly because most parents, when they were polled, thought their children would get into the grammar school at age 11. They didn't work out that only 1 in 5 of their children would get in. Parents are optimistic about their children. They think their children are more able, more special than average, and in fact, they can't all be right. In more equitable, average OECD countries, parents are more knowledgeable. It's only in places like the UK and the USA where a large number of parents really can be fooled into thinking that although for the average person things might be tricky, they or their children will somehow strike gold in the future, and so inequality is okay because it won't hurt them.
Okay, well, grammar schools, of course, are all the bad old days or good old days, depending on what you see at the 11 plus.
Yeah.
The proposed legislation may test at the age of 4 plus.
Oh, yes, we're now bringing in baseline tests in state schools in England for all 4-year-olds and for some 5-year-olds who start school at 5. They will be tested within the first few weeks of turning up at school. And the results of those tests will be used to set future targets for them. So if they do badly in the first few weeks of school, it'll be assumed that they're never going to do that well, and the targets will be low. If they perform well, for instance, if mum and dad have been teaching them to read and write at poor things at the age of 3.5 or whenever, they'll perform well in that baseline test.
There will be some chance to recover at a later age. It's not complete.
There'll be some chance, but less chance than when we didn't do this. Just as the same as, the 11 plus really set what happened to the vast majority of people in life. If you failed the 11 plus at age 11, you were going to be a manual labourer. You were not going to become a university lecturer.
Where do ideas like this come from? I mean, you wrote recently that there are pet projects.
Yeah, it's only for state school children. You've got to remember that cabinet ministers, the majority, send their children to private schools. It's not for their children. This is to sort out the wheat and the chaff at lower orders. That's why it's being brought in. And to try to spot the few supposedly very gifted children from amongst low orders who can be pulled up and given a job at the top. It's a way of thinking that pervades society if you're trying to justify extreme inequality. And the UK is one of the most unequal countries in the rich world, and it isn't like that purely by accident.
So you talk about a pet project when it comes to English language teaching for young children. That's something that always is talked about by Conservative and Labour frontbench spokespeople.
Well, it's fine to teach English language to young children, but there's often a concern about people who don't speak English. And this is a very, very arrogant concern in this country, because the most important thing about England, unlike anywhere else in Europe, is we are extremely bad at languages. We don't learn second or third languages. But we have a paranoia about people and children coming in whose English might not be brilliant. Now, most of those people who come in whose English is not brilliant will speak at least 2 or 3 languages, and it won't take them long to pick up English as well. How do you have a blind spot that says it doesn't matter if your population can only speak English? Well, the only way I think you can justify that is thinking, well, our population is so very special. It's just somehow by mistake that we're not running the world anymore.
But isn't that what we keep going back to in all of this conversation? Yeah. Is this a 19th century empire sensibility that we're talking about?
Yeah, it takes a long time to recover from being the global power. England was the global power a century ago. You don't lose the effects of that overnight.
How appropriate on US Independence Day. Thank you very much, Professor Danny Dorling.
Thank you.
Coming up after the break, one of the world's most famous whistleblowers tells us why the Stars and Stripes look tattered this Independence Day. And David Cameron educated beyond his intelligence? That's the allegation at PMQs. All this and more in part 2 of Going Underground. This month marks the 31st anniversary of one of the most seminal battles in British industrial history, the Battle of Orgreave, where 10,000 unarmed miners fighting Thatcherite privatisation battled 5,000 police. For all the brutality and numbers injured, the Independent Police Complaints Authority refused in the past few days to carry out an investigation. But Labour's Dennis Skinner showed that memories of the destruction of the mining industry — Britain now imports its coal via the child miners of Colombia — are still raw.
For a man who seemingly is never away from Europe, why is it that he's never took the opportunity when he's been there to put in a claim for state aid to save British miners' jobs? He's the man who, during the election campaign, masqueraded as the workers' champion, and he hasn't got the guts to help those miners. He took £700 million out of the mine workers' pension scheme, and he's not given a penny back. No wonder they call him Dodgy Dave, the man that went to Eton, educated beyond his intelligence.
That was the man that went to Eton and educated beyond his intelligence. For those who couldn't hear the beast of Bolsover above the shouting at this week's Prime Minister's questions, David Cameron replied by way of a Hollywood movie, not though Jurassic World currently in the cinemas.
Very good to see the Labour Party in full voice cheering on Jurassic Park. I would stick to the movie.
Fracking disaster movies have been confined to the US so far and not Lancashire. But one MP asked a question about a rather important decision made there recently.
Given the Prime Minister's commitment to localism, will he stand by and respect the decision made by Lancashire County Council this week, rejecting fracking? Yes or no?
Bear in mind that Cameron's Chancellor George Osborne has family connections in the fracking trade.
Well, these are decisions that must be made by local authorities in the proper way under the planning regime that we have.
Cameron confident that the coalition's legislation will be strong enough to support fracking, regardless of the democratic decisions of councils. Americans around the world celebrate freedom from British colonial rule today. But amid the party's parades and patriotism, what's going on with the US Constitution's Fourth Amendment, the one guaranteeing privacy? Former NSA senior official Thomas Drake says Obama's Freedom Act is just the latest law that would have upset America's founding fathers. Thomas, welcome back to Going Underground. You were charged, of course, under the 1917 Espionage Act, let alone charges of conspiracy. Do you feel now that the United States has just been living under emergency powers since 9/11?
Well, the fact remains that in some ways it is the secret elephant in the room, the one that people just really don't want to address, even to this day, that 9/11 was really the opportunity in secret for the government to disconnect, to unchain itself from the Constitution, and it placed itself under emergency powers. And the executive was given wide purview to operate in secret with enormous authorities.
And then there's always this inertia of successive governments to get things back to where the Constitution would have it.
Well, there's a paradox of power. Once you grant yourself or license unto yourself these kinds of emergency powers, and then the next administration comes along, particularly the executive, why would you want to give those up? You want to keep those on the plate. You don't want to remove them, just in case.
You've talked a bit about the how intelligence agencies can be used by corporate power. Usually everyone's always talking about the government. What is the connection between the corporations and intelligence?
It's quite significant. In fact, I've said for some time, NSA, FBI, and others in the intelligence, and there's also a broad range of surveillance programs across the U.S. government. Most is sort of this other government, the secret government, cannot operate any kind of national security surveillance regime of any note without cooperation, whether it's cooperative or whether it's coerced.
But Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook always says no. He says he's for freedom. He doesn't support what Edward Snowden revealed.
Well, I think it's a mixed message coming from Facebook, especially when you look into the origins of Facebook. The basis of Facebook was providing as much information as possible for others to see and make it as public as possible.
So how do you see that corporate power and the intelligence state after it has to be admitted, American politicians finally saying, look, this kind of surveillance is wrong?
Yeah, well, it's what's interesting, but in some ways, even the current language in the USA Freedom, I put Freedom in quotes Act, what it does, it just moves the shell game. It is true that instead of the government holding on to at least phone records, and I put that in quotes, phone records, lots of other records are not being addressed here, even under metadata collection or bulk metadata collection. Well, we'll just let the corporations keep it for the telcos for like 18 months. Now, they're actually objecting to this. It's interesting, but that means that they have to retain the data in a manner that government can request. Now, they still have to request it even under the current language. They have to request it through a special procedure through the secret court. And that's one reason why they were pushing back. On the other hand, and this is the kabuki of all this, I believe that the current language that's in the USA Freedom Act has been NSA and FBI approved. I put approved in quotes. Approved meaning they really have no serious objections to it. So here's the other thing about it, is that it really codifies what they've been doing under emergency provisions, emergency interpretations of existing or newly made law, enabling act legislation that has made its way through Congress over the intervening years, particularly after the first exposure of any form of the emergency powers, which took place with the New York Times article in December 2005, revealing for the first time publicly the existence of the so-called warrantless wiretapping program. We had quite a few series of legislative acts that were signed into law, including the Protect America Act and then the FISA amendments, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act Amendments Act, which ended up being basically reauthorized legislatively 5 years later.
So all mainstream media debate about this subject and your congressional leaders, they don't even understand that the Section 215 of the Patriot Act or whatever doesn't even matter.
Yeah, well, in some ways, because there's all these other authorities. I mean, it's important to note that even the Senate Intel Committee actually acknowledged that they were doing apparently a catalog, an attempt to catalog what they themselves called hundreds and hundreds of surveillance programs. This far exceeds even the numbers that have been revealed in the Snowden disclosures. Hundreds and hundreds? What else don't we know? What other authorities are being used? Even existing authorities we know about in terms like Executive Order 12003, what else is going underneath the hood of those orders? We don't really know.
You were a senior executive at the National Security Agency. Well, how do you think your counterparts, your old former counterparts here at GCHQ, would view the goings-on in the United States, which at least seem to show some concern about the Snowden
Well, I
revelations?
think this is critical. I mean, this is where I give Snowden tremendous amounts of credit. I mean, in some ways, it does vindicate Snowden and those who came before him, including myself and others, that these are powers that were severely abused. These are powers that government was granting unto itself in the name of national security. And we had a recent court decision at the appeals level, the Second Circuit, saying that the Patriot Act Section 215 was illegal, and it raised constitutional questions, serious constitutional. Although they didn't address that at the time, but.
For an audience here, what do you think it means for
well, it's sort of going in the opposite
Europe?
direction. At least we're having a debate. What's critical here is the debate, and that's what Snowden really ignited, was we're having the debate, looking at the real merits of these programs. Are they worth the price we've been paying for it? Or how much price are we willing to pay for quote-unquote more perfect security? And we're finding how incredibly imperfect it is. Here we got this snoopers bill. This snoopers bill, for me, is like deja vu emergency powers, but it's being posited in a very overt manner that the government really needs this just to go about anywhere at any time against anybody, right? Just in case, sort of this insurance policy.
Partly because of the threat of ISIS.
Well,
of course.
well, that's sort of the genuflecting response, right? We have to just to protect ourselves, and they'll roll out existential threats or possible existential threats as an excuse, as cover for expanded powers. How far do you want to go? You want perfect security, you got to give up all liberty and freedom. You have to give up essentially all rights. Is that really where we're headed? I mean, the sort of the zero-sum game I find extremely disingenuous, because you actually can have both. And if you really target real threats, are there real threats in the UK? Yes. Are there real threats to civil society? Yes. Are there elements of ISIS that represent a threat? Yes. But we don't conduct mass surveillance on everybody, especially from within our own countries.
Thomas Drake, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Immediately after the Tunisia attacks, David Cameron announced yet more surveillance of social media. Already, the government is preparing a snoopers charter requiring Apple, Facebook, Google and WhatsApp to keep a record of users' content and activity, from internet searches to private messages. But maybe Minds.com have a solution. It's just launched a fully encrypted social media site, and its co-founder and chief technology officer, Mark Harding, joins us now from Preston in Lancashire via end-to-end unencrypted Skype. Mark, welcome to Going Underground. Let's begin with what Minds.com actually is.
Yeah, so Minds it's a free and open source social networking app that offers encrypted chat and gives all its users viral reach.
But Facebook have introduced a kind of encryption to their individual messages.
Yes, they put as an option to use PGP chat, but as default and on the live messenger, they don't offer this feature. And it's also proprietary encryption, so users don't actually know if it's encrypted or not. You're really just taking Facebook's word for it. Whereas Minds, we've open sourced our encryption, we've disclosed what we're doing, people can inspect it and improve upon it.
And how does it pay for itself?
Minds, it enables users to have viral reach. So users get rewards for using the site. So every action you take, whether it's a thumbs up or a comment, you get a Minds point. And you can then use those points to boost your own posts to the network. And if you want more reach than what you're able to earn on the site, then you can buy points. So almost like a promoted post on other sites, we have Minds boosts.
How dangerous is the proprietorial algorithms that Facebook use?
It's incredibly dangerous because it stops small businesses reaching their own users. People who are subscribed to Facebook pages aren't able to see those pages because Facebook charges those small businesses to reach their own fans rather than to reach new fans.
And but what about the power of advertising against a user of Facebook? Is that a problem that you're trying to address with Minds.com?
Yeah, we support advertising, but we support it in a way that it protects users' privacy. We're not selling users' privacy. at all, which is what Facebook do. Facebook is a marketing machine which collects a vast amount of data and sells it on, whereas Minds offers a very transparent way of letting advertisers reach them, but one that protects them.
We now know from Glenn Greenwald that GCHQ deliberately uses Facebook to deceive people, spread government propaganda through social media. Minds.com won't protect us from that, will it?
Minds.com will protect the contents of your messages. So the users have the public and private keys. So it's impossible for Minds to be able to see the contents of those messages.
Some might think it's a bit of a niche market. It's really for people who are political dissidents, maybe criminals, not for the wider public.
Well, certainly not for criminals. We don't support criminal activity on the site or criminals using the site. We're all about internet freedom, people who want to have the freedom to be safe and private online. And that's what Minds is targeting. And I think there's a majority of people online who really do care about the privacy. It's not just the minority.
So do you and the rest of the team at Minds.com just look on with horror when you hear about Facebook's new facial recognition services, for instance?
Yeah, we think it's terrible. That's why we're building an alternative, and we're inviting people to come and use it.
Initial reports seem to suggest that you had something to do with the anonymous group. Not true?
Well, Anonymous is a leaderless movement. Many people support us, but there's also people who are skeptical. But we welcome ethical hackers and activists, people who really advocate internet freedom.
And how do we know that your management team and employees of Minds.com properly vet new employees? Because presumably we know from the connections revealed by Julian Assange of Google and the State Department, US authorities. What about Minds.com's management team?
Well, right now, Minds is a very small distributed team. We would vet all new employees.
And it's only just started, this project. How many hits you've had so far?
We've had millions of hits to the site. We're not ready to disclose the number of users yet. I don't have those figures on me, but we will be releasing them in due course.
Mark Harding, thank you.
Thank you very much.
That's it for today, but we're back on the eve of the 10th anniversary of the 7/7 attacks on London, when we speak to a union at the forefront of the fight against terrorism on public transport. And as ever, we're on Twitter, Facebook, SoundCloud and email. And don't forget, RTUK News with Bill Dodd. It's on every weekday evening on the hour from 7 till 10. See you on Saturday, 57 years to the day that Paul McCartney met John Lennon for the first time.